Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at the EarMen Colibri. This is a $330 odd US dongle device, but it's a little bit different from your average dongle because it's also self-powered with its own internal battery. You could say this is kind of like a mini Mojo 2, as in the Chord Mojo 2, but they are different devices from completely different companies of course. As a fan of the very tiny but excellent EarMen Sparrow, I was particularly interested to see how the much larger but clearly similar designed Colibri could perform having its own internal battery and costing $130 more. So come with me now as we find out if the Colibri is worth the extra space in your pocket and less money in your wallet. As I've already mentioned, the Colibri is designed to run off a battery built into the device as opposed to USB power, and that can theoretically provide much better sound quality by removing the noise that often gets introduced through the USB circuit. So the Colibri has its own internal battery and it's rated for about 5 hours. Now I have to say off the bat, I think that's maybe a little bit too short. If I was using this like I used to use these sorts of devices, going into an office space and wanting some sort of high quality device in the office, I'm not sure I want a device that's going to run out of charge every 5 hours and need to be redone. Having said that, for other usage, let's say general portable use around the house here and there, where you might be using it for an hour at a time, maybe 2 hours at a time, in that context, I think the Colibri's 5-hour battery life is fine. I'm not sure how the battery's going to live for long-term use with multiple recharges of that 5-hour runtime, but I can only assume that the EarMen engineers have taken that into account. They've made a number of excellent products over the years, and there's no reason to think that the Colibri is not going to be up to the same level of design quality. Moving on from the battery though, because that's just one small part of the puzzle depending on how you're going to be using it, the Colibri is built around the ES9281 Pro chip from ESS. As always, I don't put too much weight in which chip is used where. I've heard older chips sound better than newer chips depending on the design of the device. So I don't worry too much about that, but I'm just sharing it for those who are interested. What the inclusion of that chip does mean though, and where this is valuable, is that it means you can run DSD128 and high-res 384kHz PCM files. In other words, if you've got DSD files on hand, the Colibri can decode them, and the same is true for high-res PCM like DXD. It also means you could theoretically upsample your source into the Colibri if you want to. In addition to high-res sample rates, the Colibri also has MQA capability, so if you're streaming Tidal or you've got local MQA files, you've got no problems playing all of that back with the Colibri. I'm not going to get into whether MQA is better or worse, it's just a feature that's there for those that want to use it. And indeed I do think that if you are limited to using Tidal, it is helpful, I think, to have an MQA device. A couple of other specifications to talk about before we do a quick tour of the unit is that it puts out 280 milliwatts through its balanced output into 32 ohms, or 75 milliwatts through the single-ended output, again into 32 ohms. And that should be plenty for almost any device you'd likely to be using this with. That's going to drive any normal headphone to loud, safe listening levels. It's clearly not going to be a device for Susvara or Abyss owners, but for everybody else, whether it's for a hi-fi an Aria, a ZMF Atrium, a Sendy Peacock, any of those sorts of devices, and I've chosen high-end devices, but there's no reason not to use this with lower priced gear as well. With any and all of those devices, you'll have no problems with the Colibri, particularly on the balanced output. Finally, as you'll see in a moment, the Colibri does have volume controls, but from a specifications and technical functionality point of view, I just wanted to mention here and now that those volume controls will control the device volume, in other words your smartphone if you're connecting it up to that. That's going to control the smartphone. There's no internal separate volume control in the device. Personally, I prefer that. I think that's a good way to go because otherwise you get this issue of having two different volumes that you have to adjust. And so with all that said, let's take a tour of the device to give you a sense of what it can do, how it looks, how the labeling works. That's a key point. Let's take a look at that now. I've already shown you that essentially this is like an enlarged EarMen Sparrow. So the Sparrow's here, you can see how tiny that is next to the Colibri. But other than that, they're very similar. They're both this blocky, sort of rounded corner shape, and I really like it. They've got a high quality finish on the front and back with this black shiny glass panel. It is a bit of a fingerprint magnet if that matters to you, but I personally like it. On the front panel here, we've just got the EarMen name and the EarMen logo, and that lights up to show you things like the status of the device, what sample rate you're playing, whether it's MQA, all that sort of information is carried through the light here. It'll also tell you when the bass boost is switched on or off, and I'll talk about that in a second. Up on the top of the device, we've got the 4.4mm balanced output and the 3.5mm single-ended output, and I'll talk shortly about how both of those sound and whether they're comparable. On the bottom of the device, we've got two USB-C inputs. One is for charging and one is for data. And that's both good and bad. It means that you can run USB into this without it drawing power from the USB and potentially degrading sound quality, but it does mean that if you want to charge and play back at the same time, you're going to need two USB cables connected to the Colibri. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you like that or don't like that. I understand why they've done it. I think it's neither here nor there, and generally speaking, I would charge it when I wasn't listening to it in my use case, but that could be different for you. Flipping around to one side of the device, we've got a pair of little round buttons, and flipping around to the other side of the device, we've got another pair of almost identical round buttons. Now to feel them, there might be ever so slight a difference between them. I think the buttons on one side are slightly more raised than the other, but honestly, at a quick touch, it's really hard to tell the difference. And the reason I raise that is it makes it very difficult until you've spent some time with the Colibri and remembered what the buttons do. It makes it really difficult to know which button you're pressing without looking at the back of the device. And that's then another problem, because if you want to see what the status indicator is doing on the front of the device, you don't know what the labels say on the back. I can understand why they didn't want to put all of the labeling on the front of the device, but it does make it a bit fiddly when every time you want to change the volume, you've got to flip it over to remind yourself which side is the volume and which side is the power and the bass boost. It's not a huge deal, but it is something that I wanted to call out. I think ideally what should have been done was a clearer differentiation of the shape of the buttons so that the volume button was maybe a long oval shaped button and the power and bass boost were the round buttons or something similar. As it is though, while we're talking about the buttons, and just to reiterate, it's not a huge deal what I just said, but it is a slight annoyance. But what I've just alluded to is some of the functionality of the Colibri. I've already mentioned the volume buttons control the volume of the device you're connected to, and then you've got the power button, which is obvious, and a bass boost button. And the bass boost button is very simple. It's an on or an off bass boost. I'll talk about the sound quality of it shortly. I do think it's a nice idea for companies to provide a bass boost functionality like this, but whether or not I think it's a good idea to use it all the time, that's a different question that we'll cover off in sound quality. One final thing I want to talk about before we get to sound quality though, is a couple of the accessories that you get in the box. First of all, you get a nice quality USB-C to USB-C cable, which is great. And then you also get this nice little leather case. And I think it's great value that EarMen have decided to include a leather case like this rather than making you buy it as an extra add-on. I'm not entirely sold on the design of the case, and the reason for that being that again, once the device is inserted, there's no way of seeing the labeling. So again, you've got no idea which one is the power or which one is the volume side of the device, unless you've remembered that. And on the bottom of the device, you also can't tell which is the data and which is the charging socket. So there's just a few little ergonomic gripes I have with the Colibri. I really like it overall from an aesthetic and interaction point of view, but those little labeling issues for me, particularly when you lose the ability to know which USB-C socket is which, those little things just hold it back from being a perfect experience. And so from there, what we hope to find out is that when you listen to the Colibri, all of those gripes melt away in sonic bliss. So let's talk now about sound and find out if that's the case. I'd describe the overall sound from the Colibri as clean, smooth, and spacious. It's a really, really lovely sounding device. It's got an excellent sense of weight and body to the sound, but there's no sense of muddiness or coloration. It's just a really well balanced sound from top to bottom. Of particular note for me was that the soundstage has really good width, but more importantly, there's an excellent sense of imaging and sound separation. So you can pick out each individual sound, instrument, vocalist, etc. in the overall sonic landscape. It's basically just a really, really enjoyable sound. Now, of course, all of this is starting off with bass boost off. I will talk about bass boost shortly. Before I get to that though, and also provide some comparisons to tell you just how good the Colibri can be, I want to first talk about drivability. In other words, how does it work with different sorts of devices, from IEMs through to slightly difficult headphones? And the answer is, it's very good across the board. It uses a digital-based volume control, and that means that you're going to get perfect channel matching even at the very lowest settings for super sensitive IEMs. And on top of that, there was no hiss that I could hear even on my more sensitive options. I also tried it with the DCA Eon Noirs, and they're a fairly difficult closed-back planar magnetic headphone. I found at about 70% volume on the Colibri, I was getting a level of listening which is a little bit louder than I would normally listen, but still within safe limits. And what that means is there's still enough headroom if you do want to listen to something with large dynamic range, like say classical music, or you are someone that listens louder than what might be safe. Maybe you've got some hearing loss and you're trying to compensate for that. You've got a bit of headroom to play with and you're not stretching the Colibri to its absolute limits. I also tried the 300 ohm ZMF Atrium because sometimes higher impedance headphones can be difficult in order to get enough voltage out of these devices, but the Colibri handled it no problems at all and was actually a really excellent pairing. And so at the end of my drivability tests, I'm going to reiterate what I said at the beginning of the review, and that is that the Colibri can really drive anything that you're likely to want to use it with, other than maybe a Susvara and a BIS 1266 or something like the headphone perhaps, that's the HEDD headphone. The next thing I wanted to test was how well the single-ended and the balanced outputs compare sonically. Now power-wise, there's really no competition. If you need more power, you're going to have to run balanced. But I was curious to see if you happen to have a headphone or an IEM with single-ended only cabling, how's it going to sound from the Colibri, and are you missing out if you're not running balanced? Now for this test I was using IEMs, and when I plugged in my adapter cables for those IEMs, what I found was that if you've plugged into the single-ended output, the balanced output from the Colibri stops working. So that's just something interesting to note, you can't run both outputs at the same time. For my testing of the single-ended and balanced outputs, I was listening to The Worst by the Rolling Stones. And listening to both outputs and not comparing them, I wouldn't complain at all about using the single-ended output from the Colibri. And that's great because with the EarMen Sparrow, I do feel like you're taking quite a step backwards going from balanced to single-ended. But with the Colibri, it's only a minor downgrade. You're going to lose a little bit of the imaging separation and the soundstage width when going to the single-ended, but it's not at all bad. While listening to The Worst and switching back and forth between those two outputs, I felt like the single-ended just brought everything a little bit more inside my head. And whilst it's not like everything was way outside my head with the balanced, it just sounded a bit more open and a bit more spacious overall with that balanced output. And so where that all left me is that if you can use balanced with the Colibri, I think you absolutely should. But if you're limited to single-ended with a certain pair of headphones or IEMs, you're not getting a bad sound. You're just not quite getting the maximum possible sound. If the balanced output is 100% of the Colibri's performance, you're probably getting 85 to 90% with the single-ended. And so with that covered off, let's now talk about that bass boost. I do like the idea of a simple bass boost button. I think it's a nice, simple way for people to add a bit of extra warmth and body to the sound without necessarily having to fiddle with EQ. That can get quite complicated and it's easy to mess up the sound. So I like the simplicity of bass boost on or bass boost off, and it definitely does bring a nice sense of warmth and body to the sound, particularly if you've got a leaner sounding headphone. If you had something like an HE400 SE, I can absolutely see the Colibri being a nice addition to the body of that sound. That said, it does come with a little bit of a trade-off, and this is really common for pretty much any bass boost I've ever tried. In most cases, what you're going to get when you apply bass boost, or even EQ in general, is it does slightly muddy up the sound. And there's two possible reasons for that. The first is that anytime you're applying this kind of frequency-specific processing to the sound, you're going to be messing with the phasing of the music, and potentially as part of the processing of that sound, throwing away some of the very, very tiny details. Having said that, it's not like it's a massive night and day issue where all of a sudden things get muddy and thick and horrible. I was just aware that I felt like I was lacking that last 2 or 3% of detail every time I switched on the bass boost. The other factor that might be influencing my perception of that sound though is the way the bass boost is managed. What this bass boost is doing is giving you a shelf that starts to lift the sound all the way from 300 Hz. So it starts to ramp up at 300 and it reaches its peak down around that 125 to 150 Hz mark. And I think part of what's happening here is the boosting that's happening above 100 Hz could be adding just a little bit too much warmth to that upper bass area. On some headphones, that's going to be fantastic, on others not so much. Ultimately, I still think it's a good feature to have. It's a feature I would use on certain earphones, on certain recordings. But do be aware that you are making just ever so slight a trade-off in sound quality every time you switch that on. It's not going to stop you enjoying the sound, but it might mean you're losing that last tiny little bit of detail. The good thing is you can choose to turn it on or off as your heart desires. And so with that in mind, switching off the bass boost, so everything I'm about to say from here on forwards was with no bass boost applied, and I've got 3 comparisons to put the Colibri into context. The first is a bit more detail on the Sparrow comparison versus the Colibri to see whether it's worth the upgrade and the extra price and size. Then I've also got a quick rundown of the RU6 from Cayin, that's the R2R dongle that I recently reviewed. It's also USB powered like the Sparrow, so it sits somewhere between the Sparrow and the Colibri in terms of both price and size. And then finally with the Chord Mojo 2 as kind of a more expensive but very, very similar version of what the Colibri does. And so let's start with the Sparrow. The Sparrow here for a long time has been my go-to dongle DAC for balanced listening, and also one of the products that I've recommended the most when people ask me. I love the fact that it's tiny. It's a shame that the single-ended output is pretty poor, but if you're listening single-ended, there are very few devices that can match this without going larger and significantly more expensive. And so I was keen to see if the Colibri really was a significant upgrade, and the simple answer is yes, it is. You can hear immediately when you listen to them that the Colibri and the Sparrow have come from the same house, i.e. EarMen. There's a similarity to their sounds, but there's also a lot going on in the Colibri that makes it a better device if you're happy to have the bulk and also spend more money. Specifically what I heard was that whilst maintaining all of the detail and clarity and image separation that the Sparrow has, the Colibri does it all with a greater sense of body and presence to the music. It makes everything more lifelike and more engaging, and that's coming from a device that's already excellent in the Sparrow. So all in all, the sounds are very similar, so I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about soundstage width and separation and all those sorts of things. Both of them are very comparable in many ways, but the Colibri just takes it all and improves on it, particularly with that extra sense of body and weight to the music. Not warmth or thickness, just a sense of presence and authority to the sound that I really, really enjoy from the Colibri. And so for me, that's a no-brainer. If you're happy to have a device that costs more, takes a bit more space in your bag and or your pocket, and also needs to be charged every 5 hours, if that's all okay for you and you want even better sound, then the Colibri is the better choice than the Sparrow. But that had me wondering if maybe the Cayin RU6 was going to sit somewhere in between the two. A little bit cheaper than the Colibri, no charging required, and not quite as big as the Colibri either. Now I don't have the Cayin RU6 here anymore to show you them side by side, but size-wise they're a little bit different, with the RU6 being overall just a little bit smaller. It's a narrower, slightly thicker device. The RU6 comes in at $250 US, which means you're saving about $80 US compared to the Colibri. When comparing the two of these devices before I had to send the RU6 back, what I heard was that the RU6, even with the oversampling mode switched on, was still a richer, warmer sounding device than the Colibri. The RU6 is a great device and it's very enjoyable, but it doesn't define the sounds in space quite as well as I find the Colibri to do. Having said that, what you are getting with the RU6 is a better sense of depth in the soundstage, and that's pretty common from R2R compared to a Delta Sigma design, is that the R2R is generally going to give you a better sense of depth in the soundstage, sometimes at the cost of a little bit of width. But in this case, I didn't notice a huge drop in width, it was more just an increase in depth from the RU6. So you're trading off a little bit of image clarity and focus in order to get that extra sense of layering in the soundstage. For me, where I landed on this one was that if you're a fan of the R2R sound, if you particularly like depth in the soundstage, and you're willing to trade off just a little bit of clarity and focus in the sound for that sense of depth, then I do think the RU6 is a good choice. But if your priority is more clarity of sound, image focus, and separation of individual notes, then I think the Colibri is the slightly better device. For me, between the two, I would have a hard time choosing, but I think the Colibri might just win out for me. And that's purely because I enjoy the extra little bit of sense of clarity and image separation that the Colibri brings. And that's even as a fan of soundstage depth, I just think the Colibri wins out ever so slightly for me. But both, I can't stress enough, are excellent, excellent devices. And that brings me around to the final comparison, which is the Chord Mojo 2. Now the Mojo 2 is even larger again and heavier and much more expensive. Instead of $330 for the Colibri, we're now talking $700 for the Mojo 2. That said, the Mojo 2 does have more features, so you're getting things like crossfeed, a fully functioned EQ, albeit a fairly simple one still. You've got 2 single-ended outputs, no balanced output from the Mojo 2, and so they've definitely got their differences, but being both self-battery powered DAC and amplifier devices, I did think it was interesting to see just how close the Colibri got to the Mojo 2's benchmark. For this test, I was listening to Georgia by Brittany Howard, and from the Colibri, that sounded just wonderful. The sound was solid, it was punchy, it was clean, and the sense of space and image quality from the Colibri was really on show. I was curious to see just how much better, if at all, the Mojo 2 was going to sound. And I have to say, the moment I switched over, everything just went next level. From the Mojo 2, everything is even more defined and more spacious than what the Colibri was giving me. And it really showed me the value on this occasion of spending more money if your budget allows. Now don't for a minute think that I'm suggesting the Colibri isn't still great. At $330, it's doing a wonderful job, and for many people will be all you ever need. But if you're sitting there thinking, is there any benefit spending more? Is the Colibri as good as anything else I'm going to get? The answer is no, it's not. But it's excellent for its price. So I want to make that really clear. This is not a knock on the Colibri. I just want to put into context what you get for each tier of your money spent. The Sparrow is still fantastic, but you can get more performance if you buy a Colibri. The Colibri is then fantastic, but you can get more performance if you buy a Mojo 2. The Mojo 2 is great, but then there's other full-size desktop devices which go even better again. And so that's the purpose of this. I'm not trying to say anything negative about the Colibri, but you do get better sound from the Mojo 2. And what I noticed most specifically when listening to Georgia by Brittany Howard was that when I went between the Colibri and the Mojo 2, the biggest difference was its ability to separate the vocals out whilst maintaining coherency. The Mojo 2 has a lovely sense of depth in its sound, much like the previously mentioned RU6, but it doesn't come at the cost of any loss of detail and transparency and clarity. If anything, you're also getting more clarity and transparency, etc. And so all of a sudden, Brittany Howard's voice was sitting in space right in front of me with incredible amounts of texture and nuance that the Colibri couldn't quite match. The Colibri sounded incredibly good, and if I wasn't comparing them, I wouldn't have thought there could be that much difference. But it did show me that that recording had even more to give, because it is an excellent recording. From the Colibri, the sound was all wonderfully coherent, there was a great sense of image focus and separation on all the different instruments, but I didn't feel like I could hone in quite as much on the vocals as opposed to the whole overall mix. And I can actually see some people preferring the Colibri for that reason. It could allow some people to just get lost in the overall sonic experience and not necessarily feel like they're drawn to pull apart the individual instruments. I personally like the way the Mojo 2 presents the sound. I prefer it over the Colibri. But having said that, one very key thing that I absolutely should mention here is I can see the Colibri going in my pocket. The Mojo 2 is very unlikely to. It's bulkier, it's heavier, it's less of a portable device and more of a transportable device for me. I use it almost as a bedside device, whereas the Colibri I would absolutely just drop in my pocket with my smartphone next to it and away I'd go. Of course, the little provided pouch here means you could hook it onto your pocket pretty easily and use it that way too. So in that sense, I absolutely would choose the Colibri for a replacement to a more traditional USB powered dongle like the Sparrow, or the RU6, or any of those. That's really where I see the Colibri sitting. The fact that it has a battery power supply makes it very versatile and gives it higher quality sound and more power, but for me it doesn't turn it into that transportable and semi-desktop style device that the Mojo 2 is, rather than keeping it as a slightly oversized dongle. Now that's just my take on it, you might see it differently. Of course, there is absolutely no reason you can't use it as a transportable semi-desktop device as well, but I do see it as being a little bit more suited to the dongle style use. And so hopefully after all of this, you've come to the same conclusion that I have, which is that the Colibri is an absolutely wonderful device. At $330, as I said before, it could absolutely be all somebody needs for all of their listening setup. It's a DAC. It's an amp, it does balanced, it does single-ended, and it does it all beautifully. It's got you covered for MQA. It's got you covered for high sample rates should you want it. It's very, very versatile and extremely, extremely good to listen to. And so if that sounds good to you, I'll put a link down below. I have no affiliation with EarMen or the supplier of EarMen here in Australia, so there's no kickbacks related to this review. I might put an Amazon link down below if I can find them, and as always, buying through there is a huge support for the channel, and I thoroughly appreciate any and all support. As always, if you found this review useful, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, and hit the like button to tell YouTube and me that you want to see more videos like this one. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.